And the third thing is that for the first time is very clear goal. By third grade, children should have the basic foundational literacy and numeracy. And then it goes on to say that if this is not achieved, then the rest of the policy is irrelevant. That's a very strong statement.
Welcome to Reorient. I'm Inakshi Sobti.
And I'm Gaurav Gupta.
In a region that constitutes virtually 25% of the world's population, it isn't surprising that we decided to start with education. Here's what I'd like to understand better, Gaurav. I know we've been successful in enrolling kids into school, but keeping kids in school is a challenge. For example, almost 50% of girls in rural India drop out of middle school. In a country of India's population of 1.4 billion, that's a huge number. Boys also tend to drop out in secondary school across the country. I think the dropout rate for boys between classes 9 and 12 is around 15%. Then there's the problem with the quality of education. We get caught up in numbers and quantity when we need to be paying attention to quality. Every student today aspires to get a good job at the end of their education, but does our schooling equip students for jobs of today? According to a recent skills index that I saw, more than 42% of Indian graduates are not employable. That is a huge issue, a life-changing issue for so many people. How do we solve this? I do hope that this episode covers at least some of these challenges.
I think you're asking all the important questions. I think the way we're going to try and address them is let's actually start this with the journey of the child itself, right? Like actually taking them through, getting them into school, and we've got a great person who's going to talk about that, Safina Hussain, who, her organization has put over 1.5 million girls back into school. There's an astonishing number. She just won the Ramon Magsaysay Award for that great achievement. So no better person to help us think about those challenges, even of getting kids back into school, which, yes, India has solved in many cases, but there are still these pockets where, because of patriarchy and other reasons, we have those challenges. But once you're in school, how are we making sure you're actually learning? And we've got, I can't think of anyone better, but Rukmini Banerjee of Pratham, who themselves do so much great work in education, but Rukmini really releases that ASER report, which is the barometer for measuring foundational and math literacy skills. And we'll hear from her about what's going on there. Now, what does it take to keep kids in school? That's the next bit, right? You've got some foundational learning. It's crucial that we pay attention to the quality of education, like you said, and not just traditional skills, but things like socio-emotional and arts-based learning. These have never been focus areas for our mainstream education. And we have Jigyasa Labru, who runs this fantastic nonprofit called Slam Out Loud that is working towards improving the quality of foundational education using the arts. And I think it's great to hear her voice next to, someone like Rukmini and Safina that's saying, actually, we need to also bring other aspects into education. And it's, of course, impossible to talk about education without talking about tech, especially going forward. And I'm excited that we have Shreyasi Singh, who's one of the co-founders of the edtech platform Harappa, about how the workplace is evolving and how tech is helping bridge the gap between education and employability. That's obviously one of the big payoffs that people say, well, that's the reason I'm in education. And finally, we will also hear from Sundar Mahalingam, who's both the president of strategy at HCL, but also runs the Shiv Nada Foundation. Now, his perspective is really important because as one of these aspirational employers that's really helped us create, a rising middle class, he'll talk about his experience of hiring graduates and what's missing, what's needed, and also the work he's done through the foundation to help support these things. So I think we'll have this wonderful tapestry from start to finish on what is that journey, where is it broken, what's working, what's not working, and I'm really excited.
So through this episode of Reorient, we want to address each of the broken parts of this journey. That sounds interesting, and I'm keen to see how we do this.
On that note, let's get started with our guests. Safina, what I thought it would be a great place to start is, you've been speaking passionately about the idea of educating girls, bringing them back into school and doing more with them when they're in school. But maybe help the audience understand, who are these girls? When you say educating girls, who are the girls that you work with? Give us a little bit of a picture of them.
Thank you, Gaurav, and thank you for inviting me on your podcast. I'm very excited for this conversation. Who are the girls that we work for? We work actually, Educate Girls focuses on the out of school girl, right? A girl who has either dropped out of school or who is never enrolled. A lot of girls sometimes never make it to school, right? So we're looking at a girl who is outside of the formal education system. Majority of these girls that we work with, they are rural, remote, tribal. So you're looking at a girl in a village, and her school could be a walk, let's say 1 kilometer away, or if she's in middle school, she could be walking 3 to 4 kilometers to get to middle school. This is a girl who probably wakes up at like 5 a.m. or 6 a.m., starts her day with doing all the household chores and cooking and cleaning and then getting ready and going, if she's not going to school, then she's grazing the goats and she's fetching the water and one of the last ones to sleep at night, having done even more household work and looking after the siblings. So a girl who has a lot of vulnerabilities, very limited exposure, probably a lot of them have never been outside of their village, incredibly hardworking, but with a very, very, very limited future. Girls who, if they're not in school, they're more likely to be married early. If they marry early, they will have children early. If they have children early, their children are more likely to be malnourished or stunted. They may not be able to immunize their children fully and stuck in a cycle of illiteracy and poverty. You're talking about intergenerational poverty and illiteracy for rural and tribal girls without an education. So those are the girls that we are focused on working with.
And this may sound very like on the fringes, but this is a very large population. It runs into the millions. Like, give us a sense of the scale of this.
I have to say a lot of progress has happened, right? So it's not all doom and gloom. Since independence, I mean, we now have, especially with the Right to Education Act, we had that. And because of that, we have almost universal elementary education in terms of gross enrollment ratios, etc. So majority of the girls between the grades of 1 to 8 are in school. I would say less than 5% are out of school and probably in pockets and hotspots. However, if you look at the situation beyond the 8th grade, that's where the big cliff is happening and the girls are dropping off. So it's almost like 50% of the girls will never complete secondary school in India, right? 90% of them are not skilled or formally skilled. And just about barely 30, 35 odd percent are in the labor force. So that's what we're kind of talking about. So there are almost 91 million girls today.
What's the reason that even 70 years after independence, that we are at a place where 91 million of our population is in such a vulnerable position? What do you see as the main drivers of this?
I think the main drivers are really two buckets, right? One is societal, which is mindset, how we value women and girls per se. It's patriarchy. It's, my goat is an asset, my girl is a liability. In Hindi, we say paraya dhan, which means, it's somebody else's. It's like how people say educating a girl is like watering your neighbor's garden. So one of that is just this feeling that, what can I get? And if I'm not getting anything, then why should I be investing in this? So there's a mindset issue, there's a patriarchal issue. So those are the societal sort of barriers. And the second aspect are systemic barriers, right? So if we're talking about the largest number of girls out of school are beyond the 8th grade, we have to look at the access, right? Secondary schools. How close are secondary schools for rural girls? So for every 100 primary schools, we have 60 middle schools, and then we have just about 26 secondary schools. So that whole neck itself is narrowing. So when you combine that systemic access issue with the societal problem, that's what gives us, things like early marriage, that gives us all of those pieces that keep girls from education.
Tell us about your work with these girls who drop out in middle school.
For these girls, because they cannot go back into formal schools, we actually running second chance programs at a village level. So these are, we'll run learning camps for about 15 to 20 girls per village. We'll gather them and then in a public sort of location, run an 18th month camp where girls are enrolled into the open school and they're getting, sort of a revision, a bridge course on foundational literacy and numeracy, because sometimes we have girls who've been out of school for 8 years, 7 years. So they've also lost the practice of reading and writing. So we do that, and then we introduce them to the 10th grade curriculum, plus a whole package of life skills, things that you would get in a school. But because these girls are not in secondary schools, they don't get career awareness, they don't get digital skills, they don't get life skills, there's so much other stuff that they don't get exposure to. So packaging all of that in to help them take their 10th grade exam. And post that, they gain the credential, but we make sure they get their bank account and this entire thing so that they can actually move ahead in life to their next opportunity.
And I know you don't do anything at small scale. And I know this is the start of a journey, but I'd love to know a little bit about what scale you're operating at today and what's the scale you want to be operating at tomorrow.
Yeah, so we just started this program recently. So we started with about 300 girls, but just in a few cohorts, I think 3+ cohorts, we are now at 18,000 girls across multiple states. And our aim is really to look at 10 million girls over the next 10 years.
So what you've heard is how we've made great strides in enrollment, but there remains this still sizable vulnerable population of kids not going to school. Government data continues to show that more than 47 million kids in India between the ages of 6 and 17 are out of school. So that's a challenge which, we know how to address. We need to continue getting that number down to zero. But there is then the next challenge, which is something that will continue to take even more work, which is imparting quality education when kids are in school. Rukmini Banerjee of Pratham and I had a conversation about this. One of Pratham's key projects is to conduct the Annual Status of Education Report, or ASER, a measure of foundational learning levels in the country. Let's start with what exactly is ASER? Why did you start it? And then we can talk a bit about what it's been revealing to us over the last decade.
So the ASER survey formally was the first year we did it was 2004. But the history, there was quite a lot of history before that. And depending on who you talk to in Pratham, they will tell you a different history. That's how histories are, because you see it from your own eyes. But I would say that, around 2002 or so, we had been largely Bombay and then we had been largely urban. Much of our early work was in cities. And as we were beginning to develop or understand what is it about children learning and what is it that they are not being able to do, what are solutions, and so on, we began to actually move also into rural areas. And as we moved into rural areas, because the original team was very urban, we felt it was very important to understand the terrain in which you are, so that it could be that rural areas are completely different from urban and there will be very different issues. So we used to do this, what we called a village report card, which is that before you start working in a community, you take a look at on these two basic things. Are children in school and are they able to read and do basic math? You need to get a sense of that before you can really start any action. And the way we would do it, the tool was actually exactly the same. Very simple letters, words, simple paragraph, very, very short second grade level story. In math, it was number recognition and a few operations, all done orally and one-on-one. And the orally and one-on-one has been a feature of all our assessment work, because we feel at this very basic level, if kids can't read, you can't give them a pen and paper test, right? And when kids read, you get the outcome data, the level, but you get a lot of other information because you're doing it one-on-one with a kid. So you get the kid's persistence level, you get whether the kid is very shy, you get to see whether the kid really wants to try, all kinds of other data.
Have we met expectations, or have we, has this been a bit of a humbling experience of actually things have not at all moved as fast as you had expected them to?
So I think, the ASER tool was the beginning point for Pratham to start to figure out a solution. And so from 2002 onwards, the solution was also baking, right? So the teaching at the right level methodology was also evolving. So I think for us as Pratham and for anybody who was connected closely to us, we were not discouraged at all, because as soon as you understood the problem, you could see that people wanted a solution. And then the solution, we had a solution, but you could have other solutions. Okay, ours is not the only solution. So I think that the teaching at the right level was actually after ASER 2005, 2006. It was a very good time to talk about the results and then say, what shall we do, even at a state level? And there were many states that actually did something. Sometimes they did it, with teaching at the right level. Sometimes they did activity-based learning. Sometimes, whatever. But there was action. I think the interesting thing is that for us, as we were developing all of this, the methodology for the solution really needs kids to be slightly older. So we've always done teaching at the right level for kids who are 8 and older, so 3rd, 4th, and above. And that, if you see the results, whether done by us or but done by state governments, the results were fairly good. They've been evaluated and, people have won Nobel Prizes on those evaluations and so on. But the real issue was that every third grade started at that low level. And then you got them somewhere with the basics by the time you 1 year or 6 months or whatever. I think what has happened recently, which is I'm very excited about, is that the new education policy says build the foundation. Because it's really so, if you think about what we were doing as catch up, and if you think about where India is today, I would call it leap forward. I mean, this leap forward effort, this building of the foundational literacy and numeracy, starting not just at first grade, but starting in at least in principle or in policy in early childhood, gives you a 5-year runway to be able to achieve something by third grade. All our work in the last 15 years was sitting now at third grade and trying to solve the problem. But if the direction is right, and I think that we should not underestimate the power of an umbrella policy, because before this, there were efforts that different state governments were doing. But the new education policy does a couple of things which are, I think, very important. One is it brings this age group 3 to 6 into the full structure and adds it to the 1 and 2. It's not like you're some early childhood and there is 1 and 2. This foundational stage, age 3 to 8, this is actually a developmental stage where teaching, learning, social structures, all of this happens differently at that age than at later. So that's number one. Number two, they've laid out this importance of foundational literacy numeracy, but which I would broadly construe as build foundations well. And the third thing is, it's on page, I forget which page 8, I think, in a 50 or 56 page policy, that for the first time is very clear goal. By third grade, children should have the basic foundational literacy and numeracy. And then it goes on to say, I'm quoting from memory, so it's not exactly correct, but that if this is not achieved, then the rest of the policy is irrelevant. That's a very strong statement.
So we've just heard that the national education policy is already having a positive effect on foundational learning. Yet it's a fact that less than half of Indian kids in primary school are able to read at levels that correspond to their age. That is still a staggering problem. And the future of these kids is deeply affected by their ability to get these foundational skills. They're going to have to take an enormous leap forward to get desirable jobs. I wanted to go back to Safina on this. How does she think about the challenge that despite more kids going to school, learning levels are in fact flatlining? Why is this the case?
Earlier, we didn't have this crisis because majority of the kids were out of school. And then when they came in, right, you solved for the inclusion challenge. But these were all first generation learners. They had no support at home. They had no, their parents didn't read and write. There was nobody to help them. Their attendance was very irregular. So all of those pieces, I think it was natural. We should have anticipated it, that we were going to see a complete drop in learning levels, right? Because we had a whole new set of learners that were moving into the system. What we didn't do is we don't have an early childhood education. So they're not coming through a preschool mechanism either. So by first grade, we're expecting a lot from them. If you look at the first grade textbook from a kid who's never done anything and who has no support at home. And I think it's the success of solving for the inclusion challenge that has actually led to the learning crisis in some ways. And I think it could have been mitigated if we had taken this whole foundational literacy numeracy piece early on, if we'd done very intense foundation course almost like, before starting school, etc. So the kids were all at one level. So there's a lot of stuff that we could have anticipated and done. But I think that's pretty much the root cause of the learning crisis, at least in my view.
Hearing Safina about this challenge of, a plateauing set of learning levels, while at the same time recognizing, as Rukmini was also saying, that, we have more kids in school, we now have a more progressive approach to think about what to do with kids at school. I wondered what it would take to get beyond just simply flatlining on these learning outcomes. And I wonder if it is also because we need to update our view on what actually is foundational learning. It is so much right now associated with language and math skills, but not at all associated with other sort of socio-emotional learning, such as arts. And so I turned to social entrepreneur Jigyasa Labru, who's been trying to fill that gap in the education system by taking arts to junior school, often to schools that have no curriculum around it or very limited access. Jigyasa, tell us about Slam Out Loud.
At Slam Out Loud, we believe that our children, no matter where they come from, should get safe spaces to express themselves, to build skills like imagination, curiosity, skills that will allow them to thrive in their own lives. And when we look at our education systems today, we see that academics are prioritized. The outcomes that we want, especially for children who come from low income backgrounds, are limited to either academic achievement or at best getting a job. But we don't create any spaces where our children feel belonging and connection and build the skills that they need to live thriving social lives. Slam Out Loud brings all of these skills into the classroom using the arts. So we use poetry, theater, storytelling, visual art to build in children imagination, analytical thinking, emotional regulation, awareness, so that they can be adults who are more humane and also in touch with themselves, who find their own voice and know what they want in their lives.
Now, I imagine, and this may be completely incorrect, that these kind of skills that you talk about, people are more amenable to that after a certain level of achievement already, right? That it feels like people might define it as post material. Okay, you've got the basics right, or you're in a well to do structure, and now you can think about what feel like almost luxuries. I'm imagining many parents don't define these as fundamentals, and our schooling system doesn't define them as fundamentals. Is this correct, or are you seeing that actually this is an outdated view? There is an enormous amount of groundswell around learning these kind of skills.
Yes, great question, Gaurav. A lot of people think about how children could first develop academic skills or foundational numeracy and literacy, and then sort of, social emotional learning skills could come along on the way. But there's so much data in the world, there is so much research in the world that points to how social emotional skills are really fundamental to how children learn. And how children learn really starts from a sense of belonging, a sense of feeling that their classroom is a safe space. And children interact with or use social emotional learning in their day way more than they use academic skills. So, for example, when you get up in the morning, when a child gets up in the morning, you're making sense of it's a new day. When you're working with other peers in the classroom, you have interpersonal relationships to manage. When you're working with a teacher, a connection is an important thing in how you learn. So, almost think of it is like a plate on which you can serve like foundational literacy and numeracy skills. For example, being able to read, write, all of these are skills on a plate which has these skills like, being able to imagine. Even a lot of conversation around social emotional learning skills does not include the cognitive skills that SEL fosters. For example, memory. Again, a really, really important component of how children learn. Being able to make decisions, again, a social emotional learning skills. If you don't have the ability to make decisions, you won't be able to like engage academically with the subject. So children develop social emotional learning skills even naturally outside of schools. But if we don't create any spaces for them to really develop these well, the foundational numeracy and literacy will also not stay. So it's almost like your plate has holes, and then you keep putting foundational literacy and numeracy on that, and it'll keep falling through if the base of social emotional learning skills does not exist.
But make this a little bit more real. I mean, you used a really interesting term like memory, which I can imagine, at least to my own parents many, many years ago, would be like, oh, well, I need my child to have great memory because I can connect that to outcomes in exams, right? And I'm really hoping, decades later, parents are thinking differently as well. So make this practical. Like, what is it something that you might be doing or encouraging in classrooms, or what Slam Out Loud delivers that you can point to that says, and therefore many kids will improve their memory as a result of this? I'm just using memory as one example.
I think one of the most interesting examples with memory is stories, and stories from our own life, right? It's always easier to remember stories instead of formulae. We will remember the Pythagoras theorem, or we will remember buoyancy more as the story of Archimedes, like jumping out of a bathtub, right? So storytelling is one way that children are able to make connections, or even adults are able to make connections and build on top of that. Your formula almost comes after the story in your head. So when Slam Out Loud brings a lot of storytelling in the classroom, and one of the activities which I really really love that we do in classrooms is called My Precious, where children go to their parents and talk about an object that is precious to the parent and what is a memory associated with that object and why is that important. And when the child comes in, relates the same story in the classroom, the child is not only building like a connection with the parent and engaging emotionally, but also building memory in terms of a story that will allow them to remember why this object is precious. And stories stay with us way longer and much more than any data or anything that we learn academically in the classroom does.
A lot of the whole schooling system and what is valued is ultimately driven by people having a view on what success looks like. And then once you say, well, this is what success looks like, what's the examination that gets you to that success? And so invariably, what gets prioritized is what gets measured, because exams are a measurement technique in many ways. And I imagine this is where your whole field has an uphill battle, because it is not traditionally the field where, at least for me, I'm like, how do you measure this stuff? Can you show progress? And are you able to see that this is actually leading to something? Now, I had a conversation with you and you seemed to convince me that no, you can put science into the arts, right, around this stuff. And I'd just like you to talk a bit about that. Like, is there a solution here, or is this an incorrect way of thinking anyway? Like, let's fight against this because not everything needs to be measured and so forth. But to me, it seems like a practical way to at least get people more engaged with this type of education.
Yes. I'll start with what I believe in. I believe that, even social emotional learning skills need to be measured because that show us if what we're doing actually works and if it actually has impact. And that allows us to go back to our programs and make them better and make them better in service of our children. Coming to the measurement of social emotional learning skills, so even the new education policy 2020 talks a lot about how the arts allow children to become more humane, how they allow them to become people with agency, but it never operationalizes it. It doesn't show what needs to be measured. And because it does not show what could be measured and how that measurement could look like, there is no money that's really put into arts education. There's no money that's put into measuring where our children are at when it comes to social emotional learning skills, like I said, curiosity or imagination. When the first ASER report came out, we suddenly had a benchmark where we got to know that a fifth grade child cannot read a second grade text. However, we have no such thing around imagination, or we have no such thing around emotional awareness or agency that tells us where our children really are with respect to growing in these skills, or where do we need to get as a nation for our children to thrive and for children to become adults with agency.
Do you see a future in where there's an ASER for creativity and socio-emotional learning?
That's a vision I have for our work, which is to have an assessment that tells us nationally where our children are at on the skills that they need to thrive in their life. Where are they on agency? How are they doing in imagination? How curious are our children?
This idea of an ASER-style report on creativity sounds so needed, and I suspect Rukmini would be a big proponent of it too. And I want to take the conversation back to her and talk a little bit more about the ASER report. Rukmini, were there any surprises from this year's ASER report?
So I would say that we've had a lot of very good surprises in the report. If I go to the meat of the report, which is really are kids in primary school or middle school, mainly primary school, able to read basic text, do simple arithmetic, the trend lines, over the past few years had been, very incrementally rising. And then after 2 years of COVID, obviously there was a drop. But there's been from 22 to 24, because last big ASER we did was 22. There's actually a big increase. And especially for kids in grade 3, it's off the line. We had a very steady incremental line for about 6-7 years, then a drop. And now you see that the surge takes it well beyond, for the grades 3 kids at least. In math, it takes it well beyond the 2018 level. And in reading, it's not as dramatic, but it's pretty high.
So we haven't just bounced back. What you're saying is we bounced beyond.
We've bounced beyond. And if you look at it state by state, you see this increase in more or less across almost all states, which means that this is a very significant. And the way, of course, ASER doesn't give you explanations. It's just a temperature check. But the way we've been looking at how this has happened, one is I think that these kids, the kids who were in grade 3 in 2024, started their education after COVID. There was no disruption because of COVID. The second thing is I think they've gotten the full advantage of the new education policy, because the new education policy, in very clear terms, lays out this national goal that by grade 3, all kids must learn how to, all kids must acquire basic foundational skills. And a lot has happened within the school systems to kind of do teacher training, lots of new material. I think the policy has begun to translate into practice. So the increase you see, I think, is definitely a function of both of these. And I think there is a third element. Again, these are conjectures because the ASER data doesn't actually tell you all this. But I think that during COVID, everybody across the world had families who also got engaged with children's learning. So I think that we haven't lost that, probably the family part. You've gained a lot in the school part, and that these kids did not have a disruption. And all of this is much more clear in government schools than in private schools.
Part of what happened in COVID is obviously people turned back towards government schools because of economic pressures as well. But that has bounced back too, right? There has been...
That's bounced back, yeah. We've gone back in terms of the enrollment. We've gone back to sort of the trend line up to 2018. And so that's bounced.
But the government schools have done better in ASER, right?
Yes, but the government schools across the board, the percentage gains in learning are much higher in the government schools than in the private schools. And that's partly because this whole translation of the policy through this operational plan, which is called Nipun Bharat, has happened in quite a big way across all states and government schools. So this is a very, I think, heartening, very inspiring moment.
So Rukmini has given us some great news. At the same time, we should recognize that the bar is still pretty low. We are still talking about some very foundational things. And the whole education system, in some ways, is a relative question. Your education relative to others in other countries. And we therefore need to recognize that there's a lot of innovation happening. And is India keeping pace? So I think about, how do you move beyond foundational learning minimums to what is the innovation that's really going to help us succeed in the future? And clearly, tech is going to play a big role. At the same time, EdTech up till now hasn't really delivered on the promise. Although I think with some of the latest AI technologies, the LLM technologies, there is again renewed excitement. Firstly, for just more of a ground level perspective on this, I turned back to Safina to just see how tech is playing a role in delivering on learning outcomes that she is aiming towards. Safina, with AI, we're finally in a stage where some of the things that we thought would happen in the last decade with technology, where EdTech was really taking off, actually can happen now. We wanted to see personalized learning happen, but it was stuck because it didn't really have a human interface. It didn't know how to contextualize. At best, what you could do is say, okay, here's a maths problem. Oh, you're getting it wrong. Well, here's an easier maths problem. But with LLMs, that level of personalization has really skyrocketed. And it's amazing what some of the early evidence is showing. I was speaking to someone at the World Bank around a new study that they are about to publish, where they said that, and I think this was in Nigeria, they simply took one of the LLMs and did a very simple prompt, which is behave like an English tutor and create a lesson plan and support a set of students with learning English. And then those kids went through engaging with the LLM, learning actual English. And it was remarkable. Just from a single prompt like that, the results showed that they were way better than even top quartile performing English teachers, just from a single prompt. But that also says, if you have that incredible impact, then access is really critical, because access becomes an issue, right? The World Bank was engaged, so these opportunities existed for these kids to try out these prompts. But education is to some extent a relative space. It's not just an absolute space. So just as this technology can help you leapfrog, if you have even better technology, is everyone else just running a much faster race? And so I think there is this sort of opportunity and challenge. What is very clear is that this is not an asset-light model. This is a model in which if you have access to certain types of technologies and compute powers and so forth, you're going to be able to do just an exponential amount more. And so one of the things I'm sort of still trying to figure out is this the great leapfrog that, India keeps talking about, or are we going to get left behind? And I know you've had this sort of really interesting, I guess, relationship with technology where you've exercised a good deal of mistrust to ensure that there really is this sort of human ground game starting with the idea of knocking on every door to make sure you find that girl. So if I was to ask you to think about what you could imagine technology doing for you in the places you have described, are you hopeful or do you remain suspicious? How are you looking at this?
So I think, and again, you're absolutely right to describe me as cautious with technology. So I'm not one of those who will just get really overexcited, like, oh my God, all the problems for education can be solved with that. Because I think so technology is an enabler. And I think all the things that you describe about leapfrog, I'll give you an example. So we were running our second chance program in one state, and the state hadn't released the textbooks. So imagine the exams were like in a couple of months, but there were no textbooks for the girls, and you can't get them in the open market, right? So we used a chatbot, and so it helped the girls. So we had very high engagement because the girls are actually using the chatbot to be able to, download chapters, read them, quiz them, like all of that kind of stuff. So you were able to leapfrog all these delays that sometimes the education system comes with, right? In terms of textbooks and materials, etc., by using technology and still making sure that the girls had all the resources that they needed to be able to prepare for the exam. So yes, we also use technology, as you mentioned, for finding the out of school girls, right? We go door to door, but we're also, because we have such good data, are able to predict where the hotspots are for out of school girls by using machine learning and our algorithms. And that is incredible because it showed us that, 5% of villages in India had 40% of out of school girls. I can predict the number of out of school girls in each of those villages, right? So that helps me to accelerate the solving of the inclusion problem. And that's tremendous. We use technology a lot in terms of the LMS, right? Like, where are kids getting stuck, doing the error analysis, what sort of lesson plans do we need? And you can have a 24-hour turnaround in the classroom saying, I did the subtraction with carryover today. I can do the error analysis. I can figure out that wherever there's a zero at the end, the kids are getting it wrong. Therefore, here's a lesson plan on how we can teach this better, etc. Right? The massive enabler. I don't think you can think of tomorrow's education system without having a technology strategy. Now, on to the cautious bit. I work in gender. There is a huge, the gender digital divide, and it is real. So I think also being cautious, saying we cannot assume that just because you built a technology solution, that it will get to that hardest curve. You cannot make that assumption. And so, for example, a lot of our second chance program, we do you can have the chatbot and things, but we will make sure that the textbooks are in the camps because we know that a lot of the girls will not have access to a phone.
What we're hearing from Safina is really the incredible power of AI. And we're really just, I think, skimming the surface. There's so much we could dedicate to this one topic. Although let me just try and summarize what I have heard from many of the folks we have spoken to about AI. One of its most principal opportunities within the education sector is personalized learning. AI can teach at your level. We heard from Rukmini how important teaching at level can be, and there's enormous data around once you have that personalized learning in a school, how it can be transformative for each student. The second way it can really dramatically change learning is that it can be more visceral, right? You can use VR, you can use 3D enabled with AI to look inside what a heart looks like, get access to architecture, to knowledge that you can only really visualize and see because of technology, which today you cannot in static books. Thanks to LLM and other sort of AI technology, you could be speaking to Einstein rather than simply reading about. So there's the real visceral opportunity to learn in new ways beyond that personalized learning that AI can support with. And then, of course, there is the whole opportunity with how do teachers spend their time? The more that a teacher can really be thinking about each individual student, because a lot of what's on their plate, there's a lot of administration in being a teacher. Again, there are AI tools that are solving for that. And similarly, at a school level, how do you manage schools? Again, we have limited resources, and how can AI transform more of schools' budgets going towards directly the students rather than the administration? These are all the many different ways in which we're already seeing AI transform education. But a lot of that is also being now applied to how you think about moving from education to employment. How do you think about skilling and personalized skilling? How do you make skilling relevant? How do you make job matching relevant? AI can prepare students for the jobs that they want. And that's really critical because around 55% of Indian graduates reportedly don't have the skills needed for the jobs they want. So I'm now going to turn to Shreyasi, who founded Harappa, an edtech organization that helps people stay relevant in a work environment that's, changing so rapidly, to tell us about the gaps that Harappa plugs.
Harappa Education was set up in March 2018. And really, sort of, the problem statement that we were very excited with was there is a set of skills that we eventually started to call Thrive skills. But really, there are cognitive, social, and behavioral skills that we think are really the skills which are most critical for career growth, right? And workplace success. That, whether you're a computer scientist or a public policy specialist or a community organizer or a lawyer, the fact is that you need these skills, which we sort of categorize them into saying the way to solve things, the way to think about things, the way to work with others, the way to collaborate, and the way to lead, both lead yourself, lead others, and lead change, right? Really, these 5 sort of categories of habits of think, solve, communicate, collaborate, and lead, where we felt skills that were becoming more and more important as you grow through your career, yet were not really being addressed by formal higher education systems, with the intensity and focus that we had to. And we said these skills are actually needed by everyone. So we said, okay, we will address the skill gap on these very critical skills, which they call, the future of work skills, all of the Industry 4.0 skills through a platform and an online enabled platform so that it would be accessible and affordable and relevant to everyone. So that in a nutshell was really the Harappa promise or the Harappa hypothesis.
Now, I'm curious because, in this space of, let's say, ed tech, right, there is a lot of big numbers that are quoted, but it has actually in reality been a really humbling experience, right? I mean, how much did the ability to actually learn versus, yes, there's content and yes, there's people signing up. Like, how much did you see that actually happen? And what was the secret to that success? Because engagement online has actually been a real challenge, right? Like it is humans want to learn with other humans around, otherwise they don't kind of show up. Did you find that and were you able to overcome it?
So, Gaurav, I think we paint all of EdTech with one picture, but the fact is there are just so many. I think most of us are going to live till 80, 85. And the fact is that our learning needs change a lot, right? And our learning formats change a lot through this 80, 85-year period. So I think the value and the proposition of online learning was oversold for school children, where there is so many distractions. But I feel actually for professionals and adults, given all the variety of other things that we all have to do, raise families, be responsible for other people, have full jobs, manage homes, online learning sometimes becomes almost the only viable, sustainable medium of learning, right? And to a certain adulthood, there's much more choice and sort of self-directedness that you bring into it, which is very different from, say, school children or even undergrads, right? So I think that persona difference and that, as an adult, you make a much more deliberate choice makes a big difference in the outcomes of, technology enabled or ed tech products, as you're calling.
Well, one of the things you started out with, right? You said that Harappa, in its more original format was very much about what people have called 21st century skills, life skills, personal leadership skills. There are all these different terms. How much, when you experienced these classes and the people that were going through it, how much did you feel like you're making up for something that an education system actually failed to deliver? And how much had you wished that really these are things that our schooling system should have been delivering?
I think companies like ours exist in some way, especially on the foundational skills or the life skills that we're talking about, really as a failure of the formal education system to not address these critical skills at all. I think I'm shocked actually that more and more as one was running Harappa and, we were kind of mapping curricula of higher educational institutions as well as school education to see what we would come up. It's shocking that, you never have courses on listening. You never have a course on group dynamics. That, there is sort of, there's so much research to say what happens when 7 people come together to work as a team, that there is a norming period, there is a storming period. I think, if you're taught some of these skills and an orientation to some of these, sort of very basic things that happen, I think you can deliver projects on time, you can build better businesses. There's just so much. You can actually also have a healthier, happier life as an adult, because if you see all the workplace stress and strife and the disillusionment, people don't know themselves. I keep saying that the greatest sort of task of adulthood is even knowing yourself.
So far, we've heard from people who've spoken about the challenge of the education and skilling funnel, getting kids to school, stopping them from dropping out, and the quality of education, and so on. For most, that journey only matters if at the end of it, there's an aspirational job. What we're seeing is that at the end of the funnel, there is a lack of job readiness. We've heard a lot of CEOs complain about a lack of talent at a time when we're experiencing, or we're meant to be experiencing, a demographic dividend. So I want to bring in Sundar in at this point to weigh in from an employer's perspective. Sundar, thanks for joining. I think you have a very unique view on this because for 30 years, you've been watching this from the tech side, from the employment side. I mean, and, I think close to 20 years with HCL now. And to me, HCL is one of the biggest employers in what is perhaps the very aspirational opportunity for creating the next middle class and upper middle class in the country, right? HCL has been a big part of that. And so you've seen for the last 20 years, what are we outputting as talent through both high school and tertiary and skilling programs? And where is the mismatch? Is that growing? So I want to know about that. And I also, on the other side, aside from leading some of those things at HCL, you have a leadership position within the foundation, the Shiv Nada Foundation, which is one of the country's biggest investors in the education space from the philanthropic side, education and skilling. So that's why I'm really excited about this conversation. And let me start by going to the first piece, which is, as someone who has witnessed this journey from an employer's perspective, how would you describe the quality of human capital that the system has been putting out for a company like HCL? Has it changed over time? Is there really a misalignment? What do you see?
Okay, Gaurav, thanks so much. It's real good to be here and talking to you. So yeah, this is very interesting, right? So HCL technology, and we talk about India in general, last 20 years, starting maybe late 90s onwards, right? IT and technology has been the sort of what I call a growth engine, I would say, right? So almost, I think, the most important growth engine for the country as a whole and for employment and for foreign capital as well, right? Now, so therefore, we can't say there's a lack of interest among young people to come to the sector. I remember as a student, when the technology companies came in or wanted to do things for, recruit for for computer programmers, they did not really care whether you knew computer programming or not. All they wanted was somebody bright and smart, and that could be any engineering student. And so there's no broad issue with is not a broad issue with the quality of people coming in. And as this became more interesting, more and more students got into engineering. Number of engineering colleges burgeoned in the country. I think at one time there were some, 1,000 engineering colleges in Tamil Nadu alone, right? And churning out huge numbers of students. So you had a lot of students, a lot of interest. So that was not the first worry, right? The issue, however, and having said that, we had to do, and you say we, I mean the entire industry, you had to bring the students in and then train them on what you wanted. The students were not ready for a job yet. They were basically raw material, right? Who needed to be trained, and different people have different approaches. Like some people would, they say 6 months to train them, some people would take a year, etc., etc. And I remember at one time we thought about it and we said, you have engineer and training and all that. And then Shiv, that time, this was I think roughly 2014-15, said that, why do we need engineers for these roles? Why not somebody who's graduated from grade 12? What is this additional 4 years of engineering adding to what you want from your what I call employees? And to that, to be honest, we discovered not very much. We opened a program called HCL Tech B program. It still runs actually, and as we speak, so the Tech B program was for students of grade 12. We would select students after grade 12, and they broadly came in from, because the more affluent children went in for higher education. So this, I'm talking about children who didn't have any opportunities, and this is a great opportunity to come and get a job, right? Starting after grade 12. And we also offered the ability for them to sort of on the side get themselves a degree. But they came in and they performed exceedingly well. But we had to do a training program for them. So they came in, they spent 6 months in a classroom program with us, learning technology, learning various types of, coding and basic things, learning communication classes, etc., etc. And then spend about 3-4 months shadowing a live project and things, right? So after about a year, they were well trained and they were put in the system. Our failure rates were very low there. As we speak, about I think about 20,000 of HCL's 2.5 lakh employee base are tech base.
Well, let's actually drill down on one of the big outcomes. I mean, I think people do education for broader things. It creates great citizens if you get it right. But one of the big ones, and one of the, I guess, the big personalized returns is a job. Even though we've made progress both in kids who are in school, we've made some progress on the gender divide, and especially at higher levels, we see more in university. Actually, our female labor force participation rate is actually starting to decline again, right? And what's happening here? Why is it that we are not translating even some of our modest gains in the education space, especially for women, into a labor force participation rate that actually makes any sense? Well, we've just heard from Sundar about how companies are trying to fill the skilling gaps for our lower skill graduates. But we have other gaps in inclusion, especially a gender gap, a gap that's in fact growing as far as the workplace is concerned. Why is that? And what's the role that tech can play? Shreyasi has a lot to say on this.
I mean, this to me is the greatest tragedy, right? All of us, and there's so many amazing change makers, amazing institutions who have worked so hard to improve access to education, right? And that, I think people are always surprised when I tell them that in India, the gross enrollment ratio for women is actually greater than men, and it has been for the last 5 to 7 years. Even for STEM graduates, which one would think was an easier pathway, to sustainable livelihoods, is greater for women than it's for men. Very few countries have those sort of advances, right? Yet the juxtaposition of that happening with workforce participation falling is truly sort of the issue that we really need to pay much more attention to. And I think it's societal, isn't it? I think our societal infrastructure, I think the lack of safety in our urban commutes, the challenges of navigating commute, I think some of those are just so critical. And unfortunately, what has happened, and you'll see that even rural workforce participation is increasing, but actually middle class and upper middle class urban workforce participation for women is actually coming down. And that's when, almost that women's jobs and careers are often seen as secondary and only when you absolutely need it. Really poor people have to work, and the really wealthy can afford the infrastructure to be able to work. But I think really in the urban middle class is where we see that women are just not able to sort of, use the advances in education to have long-standing, sticky, sustainable careers or livelihoods, right? And I think most of that is because we've not worked on, there's so much work to be done on how we are structured as a society. What are obviously expectations from women in terms of caregiving and other responsibilities for the family? It is really those classic things which are holding us back.
I guess one idea that has been floated is that just as you described how technology is at least helping to solve a lot of access issues or potential access issues, there is now a conversation around how that same technology is also allowing access to actual workforce participation, because there is now a large percentage of jobs which maybe you can do from home. And that actually helps alleviate a lot of the stigma and other types of challenges that women face. Do you see a little bit of that? Did you start to see some of that happening as part of the cohorts of women that went through the courses at Harappa?
Absolutely. I think for many people, it can be a great enabler and is able to help them manage, obviously, what they need to do at home, plus have a career. One, there are just many more options, right? So, for example, you did a bachelor's in economics, right? Or you did a bachelor's in zoology or botany. And really, there just aren't enough jobs. And data science is really where the action is at in terms of you being able to get a job which could pay you well, pay in maybe currencies from outside of India, right? Give you much greater flexibility. And if you could do a 6-month bridge course that gives you that credential and you're able to access some of these jobs, I think that's a great way to use technology for working women, is being able to access short courses for in-demand skills and be able to pivot to careers that make much more sense. And one is seeing that. One of my favorite examples is speaking to the founder and CEO of a tech. They had courses on tech skilling, from coding to data science to whatever. Is during COVID and right after COVID, so many army spouses who are obviously stationed all across the country, sometimes 3, 4, 5, 6 hours from the nearest airport, right? No way they can come into one of our big cities to do a course. Taking courses online on coding, on Java or data science, right? And being able to get jobs. And I think that's a great story. The second thing that I've seen that happen with working professionals is, and we did a lot of these in terms of enterprise cohort, the shared sisterhood that could come, especially even in women-only cohorts, right? And I feel like, everybody should be a part of a woman-only cohort once or twice in their lives as a learning experience, because there's a different dimension that gets added in a women's-only space when you're learning together. The shared stories and understanding that somebody in a smaller town has such similar experiences, especially of how the homes function and what people are going through as somebody living in a big city or a metro in India, gives people so much power, right? Role models, right? People, mentors and role models that they could connect with if you're in a place where, especially with niche skills that you might not find in a small town, somebody working on cutting edge AI, if that's what you're interested in, or even on a very specific, embroidery that you might be working on, or anything that's, sort of part of your business. You can access the best in the world through that. At Harappa, we certainly saw working women and our learners be open to take advantage of some of these changes. And I really encourage short courses online, affordable, accessible, right? And a great sort of thing to add to your CV.
Let me then link that to what I'm sure is a top of mind issue even for HCL today, right? And Indian tech companies, like as you think about how AI will change the nature of jobs. Sure, there's a pessimistic version, which is, well, a lot of jobs are just going to get lost that might have existed in sort of the space of Indian technology firms, BPO firms, and so forth. The sort of positive version of that is, well, actually, individuals with AI can actually do more, and that the nature of what we do will be different, but it requires the individual to not do the grunt work, but to do the creative work. And this brings me back to this like learning to learn, growth mindset, that in a way, the follow instructions and follow the process is not what's going to get rewarded. What's going to get rewarded, or at least the belief is, creativity and your ability to take what is an infinite tool, but then use it in new ways. I asked Sundar if this concerns him.
The search is a challenge, Gaurav. The current system from your schooling to the jobs, particularly in this, I don't know so much about, let's say, manufacturing or other. I'm just broadly can only come to you from the lens of technology, right? Currently, you've been rewarded for following process. You may be creative and you may want to do things of that sort, but you don't get disproportionately rewarded for that. So there's been no impetus for people to do that in that sense, right? Now, as you say, you have a tool here which does at least part of your what I call work for you. That's being, a lot of people are enjoying it, using it, accepting it, and all that, and so they are reducing their own rent to some extent, right? But are they then going to be able to then transcend, let's say, that part and be able to use this for newer and creative things? That is certainly a challenge, and that I don't think, at least I don't know if we have figured that out yet. But I'll leave you with one interesting thought here, which I was thinking about this. So what is all this doing? We talk about betterment, automation, we talk about AI or whatever, right? To human society. And let's not worry about this whole dark dystopian things in terms of where, we get taken over and we get enslaved and all that. Let's keep that out of it for the time being, right? What it is doing to my mind is freeing up a lot of time for us, whatever it is. The basic thing you're getting is, for example, if I'm getting able to do my task 20% less in less time, time gets freed up. If a farm guy gets a machine which helps him, how does one say, do things better, his time is freed up, etc., etc. You can extend that analogy right through. So now human beings suddenly have excess of time. So what should entrepreneurs be thinking about? What should we guys be thinking about? How do we fill in that time? How do we engage people with that time?
That feels like an appropriate question on which to end our conversation, which is really talked about the journey from getting kids into school all the way to getting a meaningful job. And maybe, as Sundar says, all the way to maybe even having some spare time.
That was a great discussion, Gaurav. The piece on socio-emotional skills was really useful and a big takeaway for me. Equally, the piece that Safina raises on sustaining learning levels among first-time enrolled students. And finally, I think it would be useful to see how, whether across scale and size, tech can offer a meaningful solution. I know the goalposts of the job scene keep changing, so the question of what skills are most important beyond reading and maths to things like emotion, memory, spatial awareness are critical for many countries in Asia.
I think those are great takeaways. And I think this is a topic we need to continue exploring, and hopefully we'll have another episode on education. So our next episode is on air pollution, which may feel like a very different subject to this grand subject of education, but actually they're very linked. I think education is all about helping young minds grow. The idea of teaching new things, injecting them with new thoughts, fundamentally shows up physically in brain growth and gray matter growth. And good education systems actually improve IQ over time. Interestingly, young minds exposed to air pollution are then deeply affected and are not able to achieve the same level of cognitive growth. This is something that's been seen again and again. And so while we're going to talk about lots of things with air pollution, I did want to make that link that even this subject we've talked about just now and how we can help our young people with new skills, a growth mindset, perform better, our next subject, air pollution, actually has a deep impact on that. We're, of course, going to talk about many other things. This is a subject everyone rants about at this time of year, especially. Ideally, they should be ranting about it all through the year. And we have a great bunch of people to talk about it too. We have Anumita Roy Chaudhary of the Center for Science and Environment, Shishir Sinha of the Clean Air Fund, Abid Omar, the founder of the Pakistan Air Quality Initiative. I loved what he had to say. They had the same experience as the experience of people in India, going through exactly the same thing and same challenges, so much to learn from each other. And Roli Agarwal and Amit Maurya from Google, who have an exciting new tech product that can actually help us understand our experience with air pollution.